All right, good morning, everyone. So today we're going to talk about sex part two, and we're going to focus more on the personal side of sex when it comes to sexual health, your personal relationships, and then a specific portion on consent, and then how to talk to your kids about sex as they're growing up, because no one teaches you how to talk to your kids about sex, right? No one thinks about that part of the reproduction chain. So a little bit of a recap from last week. So culture limits our ability today, particularly in the US, but I would argue probably everywhere has a little bit of this. It limits our ability to communicate clearly about sex, to communicate in the open, to have clear conversations where people then feel comfortable discussing and asking the kinds of questions that help to advance our sexual progression, right, in terms of culturally. So how do we then start to change that conversation? We talked a little bit about that last time in reorienting our mindsets, being open to different ideas, and rethinking kind of the fundamental pieces of how we perceive sexuality, how we perceive gender, how those things aren't as binary as people think they are, to then get us to a point where we can have an open conversation. And then today we're going to talk, what can we get from better relationships, right? We talked about this in terms of for yourself, community, and humanity, as is our common framework as we build these ideas. So what can sex give us, and having healthy sexual relationships give us in terms of as individuals, as communities, and then as humanity? So we're going to get into that today. So again, from last week, brain chemistry and sex, right? So sex is a powerful programming and reprogramming tool in the hormones that it produces and the chemical processes it produces in the brain. So it's something that we should take great care in thinking about, because it is something that can wield great power over those processes and reshape how we think about not just sex, but the things that we associate with it. And then, of course, there are some varieties of function and dysfunction related to sex in terms of addiction, and that's not in it's more in the clinical chemical sense, where you could become addicted to any sort of substance or any sort of activity that produces a substance in your mind, though that does tend to be uncommon. And then there's overstimulation and desensitization, and that just depends on your practices and your health related to sex and sexuality. And then there's association. What do you associate it with? Is it something good? Is it something bad? Is it something functional or something dysfunctional? And then, of course, we also talked about sexually transmitted infections, right? And then how that idea of uncleanliness inhibits our ability to then talk about sex, infections, right? We would clearly talk about how to protect ourselves from the flu, but then we don't talk as much about how to protect ourselves from things like syphilis or something else. We infer a moral injury on someone that has a sexually transmitted infection when it's just simply a medical condition like anything else. So that's the recap. And then so for this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about healthy sexual relationships, starting with the individual. So basically your sexual relationship with yourself. And in that, there are no clear answers, right? Nothing I say today is going to be like, this is the one true, clear way to do this. And instead, I want people to think about the generalities of what I'm going to bring up today. And then there's one thing that I've talked about in the past, and that's the idea that averages don't apply regressively to individuals, right? You'll hear a lot of things in the medical community, in the psychology community, and even the public health arena, where the average age of something is X, or you increase your risk by doing this activity on average. So that's great in the cumulative, and it gives you an idea of things that would be good or bad for the average human being of a particular group, whatever group is being studied. The problem is that we vary so dramatically as individuals, as we talked about last week, even in the 7 characteristics of physical sexual expression, that those things may or may not apply to us because of our different hormone levels, because of the receptivity to those hormones, depending on what our chromosome construct is. So when I give these averages, take everything with a grain of salt because it may or may not apply to you in the circumstances that you developed under. I think it's a really important thing to remember. So one of the things that I had read about a while ago, and I'll link a couple of things, and I'd forgotten to last week, but I'll link them this week as well, about the age of first sexual intercourse. So these studies did not study whenever you had your first sexual encounter, whether it was with masturbation or anything else, because there are a lot of studies that show actually even toddlers masturbate. They encounter basically friction on their genitals and they find it enjoyable, and so that they just do that. So it's not focused on that. This is talking about sexual intercourse with another person. And they found that there are generally more adaptive and maladaptive ages to have your first experience your first intercourse. And they found that people that experienced it very young, we're talking 14, 15 and younger, tended to have more maladaptive behaviors both in relationship and then generally later in life. And then people who were kind of in the zone right around 18 tended to be fairly well adapted, and this also incorporates emotional development, affection, those sorts of things. And then people that were also very, very late in their development or late in their first sexual intercourse actually were maladaptive again. So one of the studies, and this was particularly from the National Institute of Health, examined a little bit of the idea of abstinence only until marriage. And so there are some indications that depending on how late it is that you get married, that might actually be a maladaptive practice to defer first sexual intercourse. Not that it has to be at right at 18, but very late into life, that there might be some issues then with intimacy, with actual sexual function. So those were some interesting points that I found in some of the medical research related to the age of first sexual intercourse. So for me personally, I actually didn't have sex until I was 18. I had relationships before that included sexual activity, but not intercourse. And the math in my head of why I waited until that point, because culture makes it seem like everyone's having sex earlier and earlier. One, that's generally not true. There's the perception, and kids are going to say that they did because they want to seem cool. But people do wait for a variety of reasons. So for me, it was to not get a girl pregnant in high school. And so it was more, family economics of this is a bad idea mathematically, so I don't want to do that. So I didn't. It was actually not as hard or not as crazy as people think it is. It's just it happened about that time. I used protection when I had sex for the first time. Because I had at least had access to the information that allowed me to make good decisions. My dad had actually talked to me a little bit about it, my mom even less. And then I read, so I found access to somewhere in my mom's library, there was a book about sex, not like a Harlequin novel, but like an actual, kind of like a manual. So it described different positions and development and different ideas about sex. So I found that to be informative. So I think that's important for people to understand, and particularly for young people out there, that there is no race to have sex as early as possible. There is, waiting until about, the 18, 19, kind of in that time frame. I've seen other ranges that say 18 to 22 is kind of the sweet spot, if you will, when it comes to your first sexual encounter. I think it's important to understand, There are actual human developmental milestones, as we know, when it comes to brain development, body development, etc. And then in terms of today's cultural development, that are mutually advantageous if those things line up. But again, to my next point, there's a lot of variance in human expression. Different people develop under different timelines, different circumstances, different cultures. They grow up with more or less experience. The hormone expression might be different. And so this guideline is not something that should be taken as a hard and fast rule of what exactly people should do at what time. So with that human variance, particularly in terms of sexuality and relating back to the self, it's important that we discover and explore what it is that we find enjoyable. How is it that we express our sexuality? And some of that has to do with, literally time with yourself, time thinking about that, and then time, experiencing and experimenting with yourself to then realize what is it that works for you? What is it that doesn't work for you? Because it's really hard to have a conversation with a partner about what you're interested in and what your boundaries are when you don't know them yourself, right? In terms of finding a romantic relationship, we spend time thinking about what are our compatibilities, right? What are our must-haves, our cannot-haves, and our negotiables? So why would we not do that same thing specifically for sex, especially considering how important it is as a biological function and as a neurological function and the power it has over us? So I think that's really important that we actually think about and explore the different kind of options out there. What's the menu? What's the sexual menu? What things seem interesting? What things don't seem interesting? Some of those things are going to be culturally programmed. Some of those things you're going to learn or relearn over time, just depending on your partners. But I think it's something that we should spend some time thinking about because this is really physical health. And so we should think about how it's going to be most functional for us. How does this help us as an individual human? So and on that point, this is a lot harder than I think people know this, that it's hard to examine and explore your sexuality because of our cultural programming. So we need to think about, thinking about this thing makes me feel dirty, for example, right? And holding that idea out in front of you and saying it out loud, thinking about whatever sexual position or whatever sexual activity makes me feel dirty. Why does it make me feel dirty? Why do I feel bad about this? Why do I feel shame or guilt or revulsion or whatever it is? What is it in my life and my culture that's programmed me to think that? And then to examine, is that healthy? Is there a reason for it? Is it maladaptive? Does it harm me in some way to think that this is bad? Even things as simple as masturbation and sex. Thinking about those as dirty or wrong, a lot of that comes from cultural programming. But to examine, does that make sense? Does that make sense as a human to think that? And then re-examine those things under maybe a new construct to say, maybe it's not, but maybe I'm going to have to get over that idea and that feeling. I think that's important to know that there will be blocks to examining things in an open dialogue. And then know the biology. I think this is really, really important for people to do. Beyond your basic sexual education class, and I think a lot of those have been harmed, particularly in areas where people feel that abstinence is the only way to train someone to learn about sexuality. And knowing biology is critically important. It's important just in terms of, for instance, working out correctly or identifying things that are wrong with your body. Like if something hurts, knowing, all right, what might be causing that, so when I talk to the doctor, I can relay in an educated way what I think might be wrong to come to a solution. So the same thing with sex and sexuality, understanding the structure of genitals and the nerves that they have in them is helpful in understanding why might things be useful or not useful. How does sex actually work? Why does it work that way? Why does the pull-out method not work 100% of the time? Right? Understanding the biology, kind of your basic sciences, is critical in understanding the actual function of sex and sexuality. So do your research, read books, understand how the body works, both in the physical side, but then also the neurological side, right? Understand how oxytocin is generated. Understand the chemical and hormone expression. Understand how you can build attraction and affection by engaging in an activity, even when you wanted to have a casual hookup. Realize the consequences of the activity through biology and neurology to then be able to examine what's the upside of sex, what's the downside of sex, right? Most things in life are not inherently good or bad. They are neutral. It depends on how we use it to determine what that outcome might be. So I think it's really important for us to then examine the biology and then realize what it is that is going to be beneficial to us as individuals. So at that point then, we've examined ourselves, right? We've examined what it is that's interesting for us. And I didn't go through a laundry list of things because I think the information is out there and it would take us weeks to get through all of that information. But for those who have questions or what that looks like in terms of humanism and the Being Human Church, are welcome to message us at home to have a more robust conversation, especially if they're coming from a place of guilt or programming from some other framework that we might be able to help consider in a different way. But now that we've examined ourselves, it's important to relate that to others, if that is something that is of interest to you, right? So there are people for whom relationships with others are not interesting, which is acceptable as well. But if you're going to have relationships with other people, particularly in the sexual realm, we have to then express that in a way that is clearly understood, right? That whole two-way communication feedback loop where we know that they understand what we said. And that starts really with consent. I'm going to do a specific piece on consent in a little bit, but I wanted to highlight that right there, that relationships start with consent. And that's all about respect and communicating that respect. So then it's about setting clear expectations. Again, it's important for you to know what your expectations are to then communicate them clearly. When you go into a relationship, it's not just about here's what I like, here's what I don't like. It's about the entirety of that relationship. And sex is a part of that is impossible to separate from the rest of it. So again, it's your must-haves, your cannot-haves, your negotiables. What things are you willing to try? What things are you not willing to try? You need to talk about things like how you like to have sex, how much sex you like to have, what's the frequency, the duration, how you like it to work, how you like it to start, how you like it to finish. These things are really important, and we don't talk about it because of the taboos associated culturally. But expressing these things is just as important as expressing your pet peeves, what you like to do for activities in terms of just the regular relationship, understanding if you want to have kids, how you want to discipline those kids, what your philosophy on life is. Those things are just as important. So we have to make sure that we know our expectations, communicate them, and do so clearly. And then we get feedback to say, what did you understand my limitations to be? What's my safe word, both in a specific sense, but also in a more ideological sense? What things do make me feel safe? What things make me feel unsafe? How do we open and then reopen a conversation on sex? Right? When relationships start, it's fairly easy. I like to have sex, you like to have sex, let's have sex, right? Or so it would seem. What happens when things change? What happens when you come to something new that you had not anticipated? Because that will happen. What happens as the relationship progresses over time? What happens when you have children? What happens when hormone expression changes and one or the other partner may be more or less interested in sex? How do you open that conversation to be respectful and then progress, come to some new agreement, right? Renegotiate the contract, if you will. Identifying those things up front are also important. Hey, when we want to have a conversation about sex in the future, here's how I'd like to go about it, right? Because it's touchy, right? It's very personal for us, and it might feel like we're being attacked if someone is bringing up a topic. It might make us feel as though we are insufficient, right? That we're not enough for them. And going back to our discussion last week about monogamy and polyamory, some people might be more or less comfortable with those different constructs. And so if someone is in a relationship where they feel that it should just be the two of them and they feel they can't provide, that might open basically an area of instability for them, right? Where they don't feel like, oh no, what's happening? Is our relationship going to fall apart? Does it mean that we have to separate because we're not 100% compatible anymore? Maybe not. But it's something that if you can't have those conversations, it's more likely to fall apart because that builds then resentment. So I think that's important for us to realize, is that this is a constant conversation, not just an upfront conversation when it comes to sexuality and relationships. And so there are a couple of good articles that I found, what to talk to your partner about for having sex for the first time, and then one on just relationships in general. And I think they kind of go hand in hand because you're going to be discussing I think idealistically, you would be discussing all of these things up front, right? There's this idea in relationships or even in meeting new people that there are topics you don't discuss, right? Religion, money, sex, and politics. So it's my personal practice to try and discuss all of those things early in a relationship. And it was funny because when I first started talking to Jen, my wife, she was a little bit surprised at my forwardness in having clear conversations, but that's how I kind of not really grew up in back in my house as a kid, but in my early years, I would say my early 20s, I lack a sense of shame, which is very beneficial for me. And so I had never had a problem discussing things of interest or related to conflict. So we had discussions about all of those things within probably the first 2 weeks of meeting. And she thought it was a bit odd, and a friend of mine later on came to visit us, and it came up in conversation. I was like, Chris, is this not how I always am? He's like, absolutely. Like, normally you would, to Jen, he's like, normally you would be right. These are not things people would talk about right up front, but it's something that Andrew always did. So I found it to be beneficial. It's really easy, because if you're really incompatible to start, just say, all right, well, thanks for the date, thanks for dinner, and we both move on from there. But I think that's really important for people to do, is have those hard conversations up front, because it builds the practice of communicating openly. And if it's going to be a roadblock right up front where people refuse to make the effort, right? That's not to say it's going to be easy and that it's going to be perfect off the bat. But if your potential partner is going to refuse to even communicate about those topics, that might be a red flag for later on, because it means they're not willing to change and to grow. And I don't mean change like you're going to change them, but to be willing, or to be open to change as a person as you develop, because you will change. But to think that everything is going to be perfect as it is right now for the rest of your life, I think is a little bit short-sighted. And so again, communication is hard, right? We did a whole talk about communication and why it's hard. One of the reasons is because we do it so often that we think we're good at it, but realistically, we actually practice bad communication all the time because we assume we're understood. So therefore, when it comes to things as important as sex and relationships and expectations, it takes very deliberate practice, just like you would practice a language or a sports skill. It requires practice, and you have to think about it, and you have to get feedback of someone who can say, nope, you did that wrong. Here's how you could do it better next time. Right? You need kind of a coach, and you can do that with your partner, but it also helps to bring in other folks, right? So do that practice. Practice having the hard conversations. Practice being calm, using supporting language, not being judgmental, and using judgmental language, right? So if you look at back at our talk, and I'll link it in here, about how to communicate, using that conflict de-escalating language. Instead of saying things like, you always, say, I feel like, right? Put it on yourself. But doing that communication will help you to develop that relationship, and then open the doors to have those conversations to figure out how is it that you want to be sexually active with your partner or partners. So consent. This is something that's been really important to me for a long time. So I've taught a lot of classes on sexual assault prevention and response, and particularly in terms of bystander intervention, and then just on consent itself. So I talked a little bit about it last week, but I was teaching a class where, let me back up a little bit. In all of the classes I've taught more than, I think, 2,500 people about sexual assault prevention, sexual culture, things like that. And I would survey the classes on how many people have had some sort of sexual education, right? The basics, the birds and the bees, sexual function, the biology. And, somewhere around 90 to 95% of people would raise their hands. And this was probably until about 2013, 2014 or so, from I would say 2010 to 2014. And then I would ask this following question. How many of you have been specifically taught how to ask for consent? And the answer is about 3%. 3% of people out of 2,500, which is a fairly statistically significant group, have been taught specifically how to ask for consent. like with words. That's pretty mind-boggling when you think about it. People wonder, why we have why is Me Too a thing, and why is there a sexual assault epidemic? Well, because we haven't even taught people how to ask for consent. Kind of the basic first step in any sexual encounter. Make sure the other person is willing. That's something to me that has always stood out as something that's really sad, honestly. In the years since then, in the military in particular, that question or that training has actually been incorporated in some of the initial training you get when you come in. What is consent and how do you ask for it? Which I think is a fantastic step in the right direction. But the military is less than 0.5% of all of the population in the U.S., and I don't know that this conversation is happening as broadly as it should in the rest of the country. So I want to talk about it here because it is critically important, right? When we engage in a transaction, a commercial transaction, that's a consensual transaction for the most part, right? If we want to buy a product, no one's forcing us to buy that product. Now, they might be incentivizing us or advertising to us, trying to convince us, but we go in, we put down the money, we exchange that money, we get something in return, everybody goes on their merry way. Sex being a critical part of human life, literally necessary for our continued existence, how is it that we have not yet mastered this idea of consent? And so I think this is where we make this change. We start to have this conversation, and we go out and we just say things clearly. So in a specific instance, I was teaching a group of tech school students. So this is where they're going through their technical training, learning how to do their job. And we're talking about consent. And we were in a scenario where a young man was attempting to ask for sex from the instructor, and he was not doing a good job. His way to ask for consent was, hey, do you want to, and do, stuff. And my response to that would be, she probably didn't know because, is pretty unclear. Stuff. Yeah, stuff's pretty unclear as well. So I was like, all right, thank you, young man, for your participation and your attempt at this, but please go back and sit down. And so I sit down and I changed the scenario a little bit. I said, all right, look, we're here. So I'm here with a female potential partner. And let's say the scenario is that she's invited me over to watch movies, right? So let's say it's her room or her apartment or whatever. We're watching movies together. And instead of just jumping straight in for sex, let's talk about just kissing first, right? And so I would turn to her in the scenario and I said, hey, I'm really enjoying my time here with you. Watch the movie together, would you mind if I kissed you right now? And then the audience, which is mostly young men's like, no, you can't do that. That ruins the mood, whatever. No, that would never happen. She'd kick you out of that, And I'm like, whoa, calm down. Like, I understand your reaction. Culturally, that's what people would think, right? That's not how it happens in the movie. There's a magic look, and the music swells, and you lean in, and the kiss happens, right?
There's a script there.
Right, there's a script there, right? People know what's going to happen. But that's the cultural framework we've built around consent. And I said, look, let's break it down. In this scenario, a woman has invited me over to her place, right, where she is staying, an intimate place for her. Pretty good indicator in the right direction, right? We're sitting on the same couch, maybe in physical contact, watching a movie together. So she's not repulsed by me, at least from that standpoint. And by asking the question, am I actually going to change her mind one way or the other? If you think about it, if she's going to kiss or have sex with me in this scenario, she's likely already made up her mind. And if she's not going to, then she's likely already made up her mind. So my request does nothing more or does nothing to change the outcome of the scenario. The only thing it does is communicates respect and clarifies that consent is given. That's it. And I can tell you, in my experience, I have actually done this, where I have asked for both a kiss and for sex. And sometimes the answer was yes, and sometimes the answer was no, with different partners that I've had in my life. And that was fine. The outcome didn't change. It was what it was. And we continued on with our relationship. Things did not immediately fall apart if the answer was no. I did not immediately die of deprivation from sex or sexual activity. You know, I handled it. There are ways to handle that situation, right? And we moved on from there. And then in some cases, later on in the relationship, the woman did want to have sex, and then we did. It's that simple, but it is also very hard because the cultural barriers that we have in place. And what it comes down to is the fear of rejection. In our culture, and particularly in the sort of macho male culture, we are so afraid of being rejected because it puts into question our masculinity. It makes us think that we're not desirable, that we're not the sex god that we thought we were, right? And so to me, people who would force themselves on others are effectively cowards. It's cowardice, right? When you hear it talked about that sexual assault is all about power, right? And that's true, right? It's about enforcing your power over somebody else. But I think it comes from a place of fear, of cowardice. They're so afraid of being rejected. They're so afraid of their identity of themselves as a powerful being shattered that they would rather take that choice away from somebody else than even risk being told no. And so the challenge that I have given to particularly the young men that I've taught is, if you need a drug or you need force for someone to have sex with you, then you are a coward. And that usually hits them right in the feels because it's mostly young military men I'm talking to. And cowardice is anathema to what they are supposed to represent. But that's what I tell them because I believe that. That you are so afraid of being rejected that you would willingly take away someone else's choice and exert power over them. So that's my bit on consent. And this goes back to kind of a more fundamental human thing of failure, learning to deal with failure. And we've had to talk about that, talked about failure before. Failure is critical, and discomfort is critical to growth as a human being. And we must learn to use it as a tool to make us develop and move forward. This is just another way for that. The idea that you're going to be attractive to every sexual partner you proposition is ludicrous, right? Just like if you wanted to offer a ludicrous commercial transaction to someone, they're going to say no, right? You don't immediately then go hold them up at gunpoint and take what you want or force that transaction on them. So again, it's simple, but not necessarily easy to consider or reconsider why this epidemic exists. So I would definitely challenge everyone out there to have this conversation with everyone they know. It is one of those foundational things in life that if we can engage with one another with respect and consent and understanding, the world will be a better place. And it does start with us just having those conversations and then modeling that behavior. So that's it on consent. So then how do we talk to our kids about this? How do we set the next generation up to be better than ours? So I have two small kids. My daughter is 5, my son is 3. My wife and I both either suffer or excel from a lack of shame. So we have very little problem talking about sex with other people and with our kids. There are always barriers in place, and particularly in terms of talking about it with each other, because there are those personal things that you get caught up in. But when talking about it with our kids, we determined very early that we wanted to be very forthright about our conversations with them. Where do babies come from? Well, they come from the mother's uterus, and they're grown there. They come through her vaginal canal. They come out through the vulva, and then they're born into the world. And we talk. Well, so with Ariana, so Ariana was two and a half when Lucas was born. She was actually in the room We had her in there on purpose with our mom, but yep. And then for Lucas, we've done the same thing with videos, just talking about how babies are born. So when they ask the question, we show them, this is how babies are born. And it was interesting because leading up to Lucas's birth, Jen would show Ariana the videos because she wanted her to be in there, but she didn't want her to be freaked out by, mom making loud noises and, not screaming really, but like aggressively grunting, I guess is what you would call it. So she showed Ariana the videos, and then Ariana would actually ask to watch more. She's like, I want to watch more of the baby crying videos, right? Because the baby cries after it's born and they clear everything. So I don't think that was at all traumatic to her. She looked and she understood it, and when it got loud, she went back with her grandma, who was over kind of to the side, and it was okay. But when we talk to them, we don't use words like what was the one on Oprah? Vijay. There was a doctor on Oprah, and I don't remember if it was a gynecologist or someone else, and Oprah kept using the word Vijay, and she's like, "Why do you say that word?" And she's like, well, "I don't know. It's just the word that we use. It's like it's a vagina. That's what it's called. There's nothing wrong with that word. It's a medical term." And so, basically, in the moment, she's like, "You know what? You're right." And she started using the word vagina on Oprah. But that's what we determined to do. We use the specific parts of the body, right? And technically, you're mostly talking about the vulva, which is the external part of the female genitals. And so my daughter will talk about the vulva, right? She'll talk about her vulva. Like when she pees, it comes out of her vulva. And my son talks about his penis, and he's uncircumcised, and we can talk about that another time when it comes to health, because there's not a lot of health reasons to circumcise boys today. And so he talks about the head of his penis, and he talks about the function of it. We talk about his testicles and his scrotum. We use the medical terms because they're medical terms. They're in medical books, right? This is not secret knowledge. There's really nothing taboo about the words themselves, right? Refer back to our talk about swearing and profanity. They're just words. So that's the first thing to do, is when you talk to your kids, use the right words, use the right terminology. Because if you make it seem like it's a shameful thing to talk about, then if something bad happens to them, right? If someone molests them in some way, they're gonna feel a hesitance to talk about it, or even to correctly identify where they were touched. Now that's not the main reason to do it, because that's statistically unlikely to happen. But it's important to empower them with the knowledge of what is of the actual information, and to be able to communicate it clearly and in a way that doesn't cause them to be shamed by it. If you go back to Kindergarten Cop with Arnold Schwarzenegger, you had a little boy in there. It's like, boys have a penis and girls have a vagina, right? And this was, I forget, it was like late 80s, early 90s. And I'm sure that was like a really crazy thing for people to hear out of a kid's mouth, but it should not be an uncommon thing. It's just a part of the body. And kids are fascinated by parts of the body because they're all new for them. So that's step one, use the right language. Step two, answer the questions when they ask them to their level. Where do babies come from? I'm not gonna get out a collegiate medical textbook and then give a 5-hour dissertation on the interaction between sperm and eggs and whatever else. I'm gonna give the basics. A man and a woman have sex, a sperm goes into the mom, it fertilizes the egg, turns into a baby, the baby grows, it comes out of the vagina through the vulva, and the baby is born. And they're gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna go play with my toys, right? Because their attention spans are small. That's all they wanna know. They're like, hey, I have a question, answer the question, move on. It's very easy. As they grow, they're gonna ask more and more questions, right? You just answer them to the appropriate level, right? You don't need to hide anything. Basically answer until they get bored. It's pretty straightforward. And if you do that, you will leave that communication channel open, right? You'll make it so it's not awkward, so they're gonna come back to you for information. And we're gonna talk to you about why that's important in just a minute. But again, they're only interested really for short bursts, right? They're gonna come to you, they're gonna ask a question, you're gonna answer for about a minute or 2 minutes, basically as much as I've given you. And then they're gonna be like, okay, I'm bored with this now, I'm gonna go somewhere else. And you just keep doing that. But don't make it weird, right? That means that you have to get over your discomfort first, You've got to say the words out loud at least at one time before you actually say them to your kids. You've got to be comfortable with it. Because if you make it weird, they can sense that and they're not going to want to come back to you. Here's why this is important. As kids grow, if you make it weird, if you make it awkward, and they don't come back to you, where will they go to get this information? They're going to go to their friends or the internet. And their friends are probably going to be using the internet. Google is maybe not the best place to be learning about sex and sexuality as a kid, right? There is great information out there if you know what to look for and if you know what to avoid, which likely kids do not. So if you want to be a valuable information resource for them, keep that channel open, right? Communicate effectively in that way. Don't let them use Google, right? And this is true even for adults, because there are a lot of adults that have not learned about these things. And so where are they going to go? They're going to go to their friends, they're going to go to Google, because they don't feel that, a lot of times by that point in their lives, they feel like they should know it, and they're embarrassed that they don't know it, and they don't know where else to go. So even as people get older, if someone has a question, be open and be genuine with them in trying to address their information deficit, right? It's just a subject like anything else. And then listen to the questions they're asking. Listen to what information they want. Don't just give them the boilerplate. Don't just give them, all right, here's what you need to know, now be on your way. You've really got to listen, and this is important because you're modeling for them what kind of partner to expect in the future. And if you listen with genuine interest and try and help them understand something, you're then modeling for them what they should expect, which is super important. The next piece beyond the physical stuff is then to discuss how to communicate with a future partner. How is it you should talk about sex? How is it you should talk about what things you like and don't like? How do you bring up this conversation, right? So some of the things we talked about for ourselves before. Discuss with them how to communicate needs and wants, because we're all bad at this, but if we start young with our children and say, this is how you can be better than I was, we set them up for a really successful life, successful relationships, healthy relationships, which is really the foundation of kind of individual happiness. So it's incredibly powerful.
Probably societal happiness too.
Absolutely. So there's a good TED Talk that I'll link, Sue Johnson, What We Don't Teach Kids About Sex. And she talks a lot about the things surrounding sex, touch, affection, right? How do you like to be touched? How do children like to be touched, right? Even as they're growing up, they like hugs, right? They like cuddling. My son, when I pick him up, a lot of times he'll grab my hand and he'll rub his thumb on my hand somewhere. Or he'll have his hand behind my neck and he'll just be touching it very gently. Right? He's learning through that experience with human contact. And so how do we talk to them about that? How do they then express it to somebody else? But we don't even think about that. We give them the birds and the bees. Here's how the function works. Now go away. You're making me uncomfortable. Right? How do you lead up to sex? Right? Monty Python, right? The meaning of life, when they give the sex instruction in there. They talk about, it's actually not a terrible instructional video because they talk about arousal and they talk about what leads up to it. You don't just jump right into it. It's a little abbreviated, but it is also funny, right? We have to talk about all of those things. Hey, it's not about just diving right in. It's about having a connection. It's about expressing yourself through touch, right? It's a form of communication, right? When you go back to the 5 love languages, physical affection is one of those languages. It's one of mine. I really like physical touch. To me, that communicates love for me when my wife comes up and just gives me a hug or rubs my back or, whatever it happens to be. Sex is a part of that. It's kind of a dialect of that. Sex is one part and then just general affection is another. But we don't even talk to our kids about that piece. That means that right now they learn it all through experience, all through their interactions with you, with other people. So it's really important, I think, that we bring that out and hold it in front of us as a subject to talk about it and say, this is really important because it sets the foundation for any more advanced, I guess, physical activity. But that's a good video. I would recommend that as well, and I'll link that later. And then the last part for our kids is to model good behavior, right? So if you're married or you have a partner, what do you do that models good behavior or bad behavior? And you've really got to ask yourself this question. Because it sounds easy, but it's hard to do. And it's hard to do consistently. And we're all going to fail from time to time. We're all going to get mad at our partners. We're all going to demonstrate, something that's not the best. But we have to think about it and try and talk to them about it, about what things that you've done are good and what things aren't. So, do you treat simple things? Do you treat your partner with respect? If you do, great, because that's going to set the expectation for your children that people should treat each other with respect. If you don't, you're going to teach your child that they should not expect respect from their partner. And I think that's really important. And then how do you model touch, affection, communication, right? Do you constantly have screaming matches, or do you have reasoned discussions where you disagree? And then if your kids ask, what are you talking about? Tell them. We're having a conversation we currently disagree about something, whatever that something is. Maybe it is sex. And right now we're having a conversation to try and come to a good agreement together, right? So we might be a little bit frustrated, but we still love each other and respect each other, and we're working through that conversation, right? Just modeling that little bit sets them up for a huge amount of success. Because it's really, children, it's all about monkey see, monkey do, right? They will only do what they've seen in their lifetime, without some significant counter-programming later on in life. Whether through partners or self-reflection or whatever, it's really hard to reprogram. It's much easier just to do things right the first time. So that's something that I try and remember is, what example am I setting for my kids? And then last week, Chris talked about this idea of horror, particularly when it comes to transgender or people operating out of what we stereotypically think as normal. And so I did some research on it, and it's basically, two similar things, right? So in this case, a boy and a girl kind of combined, that it makes us uncomfortable, right? It's something that creates for us revulsion. Now, I think a lot of that is cultural programming, right? Just because we don't see things in that way. We see things as one or the other. And so when they're together, we don't know how to categorize it, and that gives us some discomfort. So I think that's important, particularly when it comes to modeling good behavior, because when you see something that's different, or your kids see something that's different, if you respond with revulsion, you're just passing down that programming to them. To say they're different, you should be afraid or uncomfortable by that. And so I think it's really important to counteract that. And really the way to do that is by finding the humanity in whatever it is that we're looking at. Right? Whether it's other people who are different, people who are hateful. How is it that they're human like us? So I finally got to watch Captain Marvel last week. And in that movie, right, the Skrulls, which are the shapeshifters, are painted as, despicable, inhuman, whatever. And it turns out that they ended up being the good guys in the end. Sorry if I spoiled the movie for you. And characters were able to kind of overcome that by looking at their humanity, right? There were scenes where it clearly demonstrated their humanity, that, oh wait, they are actually more like us than who we thought were the good guys. And a lot of it had to do with appearance. So how is it that we're finding the humanity in others? How is it that we're modeling treating others as humans and treating each other with respect for our kids? So why is all this important? So as I talked about in the beginning, we want to set our kids up for success greater than our own. And there's that whole saying, we stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. But we also stand on the foundation of those set before us. Not all of those foundations are good or stable. And when it comes to this fear of sexuality and this binary thought of sex, I think we need to either repair the foundation we have or set it aside and find a new one that's more stable, that helps us to grow and progress into the future. So while this was a talk about sex, it was also a talk about questioning what foundational assumptions we start from, and then how that affects our ability to progress as humans. So I'd ask you all to do a little bit of reflection after this and think about, what preconceived notions do I have? How are they useful to me? How are they not useful to me? And how am I passing those useful or not useful things on to the next generation? So let's set that foundation, particularly in terms of stable human relationships, because to me that's where it starts. Stable relationships is the foundation for building a better society and the future of humanity. So with that, thank you for coming out today. I hope it was something useful and beneficial, as well as something somewhat salacious. And then I hope you can bring that forward to have those open conversations, practice that communication that's hard, and then build better relationships for yourself and for others. So thanks very much. Have a great week.